All right, this is Follow Him Evening, week 21. It's going to be a little different than normally because I have a really obnoxious cold. I'm not quite sure yet. So what I'm going to do, because I don't know how I'm going to feel on Thursday at 8 o'clock, is tape some of this in bits and pieces and try to splice together some sort of a video for Thursday. I apologize in advance. There won't be a regular Thursday video, but there'll be this replacement video. So what I'd like to talk about, Deuteronomy 27, Mount Ebal, and what we find there, and some archaeological discoveries that are quite current, as well as Deuteronomy as seen through the Book of Mormon. And I know this is a little bit different, but we'll try to see how that goes. Are all changes good? Commandments are given for our protection and prosperity. Modern phylacteries and kings have rules as well. So if you remember, Deuteronomy is broken up into these three speeches that are given by Moses, and the first one deals with kind of a review. This is the next generation because the first generation has died off, and this next generation is getting kind of a history lesson of what has occurred. I'm going to jump right away into Deuteronomy 27 because here the Israelites are told to cross the Jordan, build an altar, and worship the Lord. But it's done in a really unusual way. He has half of the Israelites stand on one particular mountain, and the other half of the Israelites stand on another mountain. If you look at the map of Samaria, you see these two mountains. Here they are. They're about 1 mile across from each other, and there's kind of a natural amphitheater that occurs between them. So if you're standing on one and shouting, you can be heard on the other one, and vice versa. Archaeologists have been looking for centuries for this altar that was built by Joshua, and they haven't been able to find it. But recently there's been an archaeological dig that has discovered the altar, and it wasn't exactly where they thought it was. And so I found this video that I want to play in part to you, but it shows their discovery.
On mountains. He wrote the story on the actual mountains themselves, because these two mountains, as close as they're like sister mountains.
Right.
One's full of springs, life, there's buildings, there's, like you said, one is desolate. There's Mount Ebal, there's nothing on it except for a military base at the top that's current day construction. But nothing on one,
yes,
life and everything on the other.
Right.
And choose this day whom you're going to serve. There's so much to say about this location, right?
Right. So there's really a lot to say about this, but we want to focus today about the
Right.
what they found there. And if we, the term or the expression to look for a needle in a haystack, right?
Right.
This is exactly the story there. Because if you go to this, so as I said, people were already looking for an altar there.
Yeah.
And they didn't found. Why they didn't found? They always looked in the location which on the north side of Mount Ebal, because the north side is the side that is opposing Mount Gerizim, and they expected that the altar will be in the same place where there was this event of blessing and cursing, which they stood on the two sides of the valley. So they looked on Mount Ebal on that side, but nobody found any altar there.
And when did they start looking? I mean, when did this really start happening?
Around the second half of the 19th century, people like Indiana Jones, that's concept. They were looking some big treasures.
The
somewhere.
ark is hidden in the caves, right?
Yes,
yeah.
And also the altar of Joshua. That was also very exciting for some people.
So you can watch the rest of that video if you wish, because this video is going to be kind of short because I'm not feeling very well. You can make up some of that time by watching that video. All right, moving onward, I want to look a little bit at the timeline here. You can see that there was a king named King Josiah who instituted some reforms in 640 to 609 BC. And the reason he did this was because he found this book of Deuteronomy. This would be after the Babylonian captivity, and this would be before Lehi leaves and goes to Jerusalem. In that period of time after they're released from Babylon, the king finds this book of Deuteronomy and institutes some really significant changes to gather the people in. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. Let's look at some of the changes that he makes. Josiah has this top-down purge of the religion of Israel. It's embraced by all of the higher-ups in the kingdom, and it becomes the kind of new religion. Prior to Josiah, there was mention of a divine family and a council of gods. But in Deuteronomy, it's declared, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and there are no other gods with me." This was a new way of thinking. Exodus had affirmed that the leaders of the Israel saw a God with a body. But in Deuteronomy, there's a change in this theology where they just hear a voice and there's no similitude, only a voice, no body. Also, prior to this time, the idea of God having a wife was pretty commonplace. But after this time, it's never mentioned again. As part of his reforms, all of the worship places and mountains have been removed. The worship is centralized at the temple, and this book of law that he discovered forbids any kind of sacrifice outside of the temple at Jerusalem. It also severely limits prophets' visions. It designates the Levites as priests, and it makes God a formless voice. So what we have, if we look at this, and I'm looking at it through the lens of the Book of Mormon, we have a kind of a difference, a change. On the one side, we have a divine council, a God with a body, a God with a wife, sacrificing at any altar on a high mountain, prophets having visions, the Redeemer comes to save us. And on the other, opposite side, we have only one God, not a council. God is a spirit. There's no mention of God having a wife. Sacrifice can only happen at the temple. There's very, very limited revelation. And the law saves us. There's not much mention of a Redeemer. But in the Book of Mormon, you find this kind of middle line where Lehi, when he goes and he prophesies, and he tells of the pending destruction of Jerusalem, the people don't believe him. When he talks about God having a physical body, that he's seen him, they don't believe him. When he talks about a Redeemer coming, that he's had this vision, they don't believe him. And the reason they don't believe him is because of these new reforms that the king has instituted that has kind of modified the religion. And so he's kind of on the outs with everybody, and they think he's mad, and they think he's strange, and they want to get rid of him. Apparently Laman and Lemuel buy into these reforms that are made by the king because they don't believe in visions. They don't believe what their dad is saying. They don't believe that they need to leave. We also notice that the first thing that Lehi does as soon as he gets outside of the jurisdiction of Jerusalem is that he builds an altar and sacrifices. The new law required that you do this pilgrimage to the temple. But once you're outside of a certain area, then you can still build an altar, and that's what Lehi does. There are also some changes in Deuteronomy 16 with respect to the Passover and how that occurs. I think it's valuable and perhaps a bit of an understatement to say that Lehi may not have been in complete agreement with Josiah's reforms. Lehi's heritage goes back to the northern Israelite kingdom, to which these reforms showed a certain degree of hostility. The antagonism of the Deuteronomy history to the northern kingdom and the Book of Mormon's affiliation with that kingdom should suggest at least the possibility that Lehi might resist some of the reforms. This is not to say that Lehi was completely opposed to the reforms. In fact, Lehi and Nephi do appear to be positively influenced in some ways by the ideology. One way to look at how Lehi might have felt about Josiah's reforms is to consider how the changes brought about by the Protestant Reformation changed the landscape of Christianity. In many instances, this reform was beneficial to Christianity and the spread of the truth. On the other hand, not all the changes brought about by the Protestants were inspired or true. This may help modern students in processing these changes that Josiah brought about anciently, as he and the priests changed the text and the beliefs of the Jews in this turbulent time period. Both Lehi and Nephi give us clues as to how their beliefs about God differ from those of the Deuteronomists. Of course, the text of the Book of Mormon never uses that phrase, but it does tell us that Lehi and Nephi were at odds with the Jews for their time. and that their ideas did not completely harmonize with the people. Some of the things that the Jews of Lehi's day disagreed with were Lehi's teachings about a suffering Messiah, the idea that God is not seen, the prophecy of Jerusalem coming to a destruction, Lehi's construction of an altar outside of the temple, the visionary experiences of Lehi. Lehi and Nephi taught that it is not the law that saves a person, rather it is Jesus Christ the Messiah that has the power to save. Lehi's teachings did coincide with their teachings in that he stated that obedience brings blessings and disobedience brings cursings. They also stressed the importance of keeping the law of Moses. Yet they balanced this idea with the knowledge that it is Christ that saves us, not the law. God's view of the commandments is very explicit in Deuteronomy 5, 6, and 18, where they talk about the commandments are given for our protection and prosperity. This is a very prevalent theme throughout the Book of Mormon, that if you obey the commandments, the Lord will prosper you. And then you get into this whole pride cycle thing. Interestingly enough, Joseph Smith said, as God has designed our happiness and the happiness of all his creatures, he never will give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote the happiness which he has designed, and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who become recipients of his law and ordinances. From Brigham Young, we have the following that has to do with prosperity. The worst fear that I have about this people is that they will get rich in this country, forget God and his people, wax fat, and kick themselves out of the church and go to hell. This people will stand mobbing, robbing, poverty, all manner of persecution, and be true, but my greatest fear for them is that they cannot stand wealth. When you look at the Book of Mormon, and when you understand that Mormon and Moroni are editing their records of over 1,000 years based on what they feel that we'll need today, and they're looking at the downfall of their civilization and saying, what happened? What did we do wrong? And they're including those stories and those scriptures that will help us in our day. So we shouldn't be at all amazed as members of the church at what happened in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, where the editors, we just don't know who they are exactly. They look at the story of the Israelites, they see what's gone on that's been wrong, and they're editing it to give us an idea of what we should do or what the people should do in order to not fail. They're looking back in history and pulling the stories together and editing the book so that they can help the Jews to move forward and to stay righteous, or what they think is righteous, to stay true to their religion. And so there's this editing that goes on. I want to talk for a moment about phylacteries, which are these small leather boxes that Orthodox Jews wear to remind them about their scriptures. And I want to talk a little bit about how we could deal with this in a modern sense. Now remember, ancient peoples did have their own private, personal copies of the scriptures like we do today. They might copy out a little bit and put it in these phylacteries so that they could remember the Word of God. But we're at a severe advantage in what we have available to us today. From Elder Bednar, we have the following. I don't know of a better way to always remember him than to daily study the scriptures. That covenant is not an abstract notion, but it can be reflected in meaningful personal prayer every morning and every night, and in diligent study of the scriptures. When I served as a stake president and interviewed literally hundreds of members of the church, especially in temple recommend reviews, one of the questions is, do you remember and keep the covenants that you have made? I don't recall anyone ever saying no. I do recall some people who, when I would inquire further, tell me a little bit about your scripture study, would say, well, I don't really have time. And then I would ask, well, tell me a little bit about your personal prayer. Well, I'm not always consistent as I should be. On some occasions, I would then inquire, then do you in fact keep the covenants to always remember him? The covenant that we make in the waters of baptism is a commitment to always remember him through meaningful prayer and diligent study of the scriptures. I think that we will be held accountable for what we have. Unlike the Israelites of old, we have so much available to us, and I think the Lord will require from us a much more diligent effort to read our scriptures and partake of the living waters that are so abundantly available to us today.